Up next is Pamela Fox talking about PhoneGap Pain Points.
Hello. Hi. So before I talk about me for 20 minutes, I thought I should find out about you guys, because I'm just kind of curious what the audience is like here. So how many of you guys have used PhoneGap? Cool. Oh, wait, okay, we'll do the inverse then. How many of you haven't used PhoneGap? Okay. And how many of you are in love with PhoneGap and think it can do no wrong? You should hire that dude. Okay, cool. All right. So most of you guys have used PhoneGap. That's cool because I'll be talking about my experience with PhoneGap, and hopefully it'll jive with you, and we can talk about experiences later together. So back to talking about me. So about a year or 2 years ago, I was working at Google in Google Australia, working for developer relations, working with developers to use our APIs. I was on the Google Wave APIs, so you can imagine that it didn't go so well at the end there. So I decided to quit, and I figured, all right, I've quit now. What should I do next? And I wasn't really into doing the whole company thing. I was kind of burned from the company thing because, big companies, you get tired of them after a while. So I was like, well, I will just sit by myself in a room and hack on apps and make my own apps and see what it's like, to be a developer, a free-range developer in the world. So I started hacking on an app, and the app I started hacking on was actually a nutrition tracking app. And this was a very fitting app after being at Google for 5 years, surrounded by micro kitchens. And it was an app that I desperately needed myself. So I started as a web app, right? Because that's what I was familiar with. That's what I had built at Google, was doing a lot of web stuff. So my web app was, like a Python app engine backend, a JavaScript front end, that sort of thing. But then I realized that it would be really useful if I had a mobile app, right? Because then I could actually take pictures of my meals, and that would make it easier to track what I was eating. So I was like, all right. So I mocked out the mobile app, and I realized, the big feature is really being able to take a picture. And I realized, unfortunately, there was no way using HTML and JavaScript to actually get pictures, right? There's the Get User Media API now, but that wasn't even close to existing back then. All right, so I was like, all right, I'm going to have to make some sort of native app. So I considered my options, right? Because you have a lot of options. So I considered native, but I was like, well, I don't really want to do iOS because Objective-C is a crazy-looking language. I don't really want to do Java because I grew up doing Java as a kid, and my dad used to blackmail me into doing it in order to get allowance. And so I kind of have, I just have some childhood trauma, really. So I avoid that. And then it's like, well, and I also just don't want to have so many code bases because it's just me in a room hacking, right? So there's only so much code I can write. And I also considered stuff like cross-compiling, right? So I tried out Titanium, and I was like, oh, this is kind of neat. I can use JavaScript, and it's a cool language, and I can output it. But then I just didn't really like how much time it took to actually get the interface working the way I expected. And I was like, man, I already know how to build web apps using web technologies, and it would be really sweet if I could just use those web technologies. So I settled on PhoneGap, and probably a lot of you guys went through a similar decision process when you were picking PhoneGap as well. So I decided to go the hybrid route using PhoneGap to make the app. So in the end, this is what the app looked like on iPhone, and I was using PhoneGap, I was using Twitter Bootstrap, and then just Zepto and JavaScript libraries. So I was not using a particular framework like Sencha or jQuery Mobile, just kind of a bunch of micro libraries strung together. And I was outputting to Android and iOS. So it worked pretty well. At least the easy part was just getting to work, right? The cool thing about using PhoneGap is that I was able to make my first version of the PhoneGap app very quickly, right? It took a day to make the first version. I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. I have an app, and it's really an app, and I didn't have to learn a new language or revisit childhood trauma. But then I learned that it's very fast to get your first version up of your PhoneGap app. But then when you start really trying to make it work really well, that can take a long time, right? When you start dealing with oh, how can I make it feel more native? Or how can I make sure it works on lots of devices? How can I avoid Android bugs on this device and this device, right? That's where it takes a lot of time. And that's where I spent most of my time when doing PhoneGap, was just all these little things that would build up and take a lot of time. So for today's talk, I'm going to focus on the parts of PhoneGap development that were not as fun. So this is where it gets dark. So these are the PhoneGap pain points. And there's three main areas of PhoneGap pain points. There's the actual docs, right? How you're getting to start using the PhoneGap API. And then there's actually the native bridge and communicating with those stuff like the camera API and that stuff. And then there's finally, and this is the worst, is dealing with mobile browsers, right? I mean, really, when you're doing PhoneGap development, you're doing hybrid app development. And so this mobile browser thing is something that anybody would deal with doing any sorts of hybrid app development, whether you're using Trigger.io or PhoneGap or any of those things. But it is definitely something you're to deal with, and for me, it was the most painful part. So let's go into the docs. And this has been touched on a couple times already, but that name change was a bitch, all right? So we started off with PhoneGap, and PhoneGap, I think, is a great name. It's perfect. Like, it makes so much sense. I cannot come up with a better name than PhoneGap. But then the whole Apache acquisition happened, or not acquisition, however you call it when you get Apachified, Apachification. And callback. Callback is the worst name because we use callback. I mean, when you try and search for it, callback is already a word that we use in programming, right? It's like right now I've been using zombie.js for the last 3 days, and every time I search for it, I just get all these results about zombies and zombie movies. And that sucks because like I'm kind of afraid of the dark, and there's all these scary things now. So you gotta be careful when you're naming stuff. Like, first of all, you know, don't name after really famous, scary people like zombies. And second of all, don't name it after, you know, one of the most common programming concepts in web development now. So that sucked. So then they came up with some name, Cordova, which is like a street name, yeah, where they grew up or had their happy days. Well, you're still growing up, right? So yeah. So I was like, okay, all right, fine. But then as it turns out, we're kind of still using PhoneGap, right? So now, and they said like, oh, yes, of course, it's obvious. Cordova is the open source project, and PhoneGap is the product. But, you know, when you're using them, they're interleaved, right? Because when you're going to file issues, you're filing issues in the Apache Cordova issue tracker, right? And when you're, you know, using some of the things, they're titled Cordova. So when you're posting in the forum, you're like, wait, what do I call it? And then you just end up having all these slashes everywhere, and it's really awkward. And I have made a scientific graph showing the difficulty in searching for something versus the number of product names. Because that, for me, is a big problem, right? Like, we have this lovely thing called the internet where people post answers to things, and you can look for answers to things. And it really helps when you have something you can search for to find those things. So having 0 product names is shitty, because there's nothing to search for. 1 product name is really a sweet spot, right? Because you just have to put that one word. And then it just gets worse and worse, right? So that means that technically, like on Google, you have to end up doing something like this, right? And I don't even know if this is the right Boolean syntax to work with in Google, so I don't know if they understand the brackets. So you're basically screwed. So yeah, I'm not really a huge fan of the whole name thing. I understand it's something you have to do to be part of Apache and proper and open source and blah, 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 but not a fan. And then we had the repository change, right? So they were on GitHub, and how many of us have a GitHub account? Everyone, yay. And yeah, I don't actually think GitHub is perfect. I think, according to their Twitter stream, they spend a lot more time drinking than actually making any new features. But we are all used to it, and we have GitHub accounts, and we know how it works, and we know the issue tracker, and it's a fairly simple issue tracker. You know, it's pretty happy with it being on GitHub. But then they moved it to the Apache, and Apache uses this old version of the Jira issue tracker, I think, which was forked like several years ago, like back in the 90s or something, right? So it's got this very kind of 90s UI. And then when you're searching for issues, you actually have to start off by even selecting the Apache Cordova project. And then you have to do all this other stuff. So thankfully, I ranted on Twitter, and Brian gave me a URL to bookmark. So all you guys have to do is write this down. It's issues, let me just read it out. Issues.apache.org/jira/occur/issue-navigator.jsp reset true JQuery query project CB3 and fix version 221. I can't read escaped stuff. So anyway, you can get it from the slides. So very, very user-friendly URL. So I'm not a big fan of the repo change, because now in order to contribute, you have to sign up for an Apache account. And as I remember, I think they even gave me my password in plain text in the confirmation email, so don't use your password that you use everywhere else. Not that I did. So you have to sign up for an Apache account, and you have to learn how to use their issue tracker. And it's just really hard to use. So I have filed issues in there. Like I managed to convince myself to get an account. But then when I try and find them later, the only way I can find them is to actually search through my email and find a link to them, because it's too hard to find it that way. So I'm not a huge fan of using this thing, which is, I'm sure it works great for the project team, but for outside contributors, I think it makes it a higher barrier to entry, right? And I think that's actually a big deal. Is for casual contributors. And I think GitHub has done a really good job of making a low barrier of entry for contributing on things. So it's a shame to have it be higher. But you should all get an Apache account and don't use a secure password, and it'll be all good. All right, so besides that, the docs are pretty good. There are some that are out of date. I wouldn't recommend looking at the PhoneGap, the wiki.phonegap.com. I find that is a variable of datedness, but docs.phonegap.com is pretty fantastic, so stick there. So then we get to actually using the PhoneGap API in the native bridge. So for my app, the main thing I was using via the API was the camera, right? And in the first version, it worked. It worked great, right? I could take pictures on iPhone, and I could take pictures on Android, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. And so I put out my app, started off with Android. And then I immediately got reports that on some people's Androids, they were getting bugs, right? The app would crash as soon as they took a picture, or they would get this out-of-memory bug or something like this, right? So that's when I first discovered that Android devices are all unique in their special way, and they all crash in a different way. And these were all bug reports from a Nexus S. So somehow I managed to get 4 different bug reports all from a Nexus S, because every Nexus S managed to crash in its own special way. So that was interesting. So that was yeah. So basically, as it turns out, there was a lot of issues with the camera API and Android and memory. And there were several bugs about this. Here's one of them. And he cites all these different group postings about it. And he actually said, like, oh, it seems that PhoneGap is unusable as an app platform for Android if the camera is involved. And that's going a bit to the extreme there, but there was a lot of people experiencing issues with the camera API and memory errors. Luckily, though, people were sharing solutions. So what I ended up doing was cloning PhoneGap and cloning the actual, PhoneGap Java files and building my own PhoneGap. And that way, I could actually put fixes into the Java code themselves. Because sometimes that's what you're going to have to do, is you're going to actually have to put the fixes in yourself, right? If you really care about camera API for your app, and there's issues with it that the PhoneGap team hasn't gotten around to, then you may end up having to fork it. So as it turns out, you can't actually, at least for me, I wasn't able to avoid Java, and I wasn't able to avoid iOS. But at least I wasn't spending all of my time in Java and iOS for PhoneGap. So in order to kind of fix this, first I ended up getting this fix for the actual camera.java, which just had better memory handling. And then also in my JavaScript, I would check to see if I was on Android. And if I was on Android, I would just automatically degrade the quality of the picture and change the width and height to be smaller, right? So basically, that's like graceful degradation for Android and punishment for using Android, which I use as well, unfortunately, because it's so cheap. Well, the problem is, as a Googler, that I've gotten so many, or as a former Googler, I've gotten so many free Android phones that I cannot contemplate the idea of paying for a phone. So until somebody gives me a free iPhone, I'm going to keep using my free Android phones. So that mostly fixed the Android camera issues. But then I also discovered other issues with Android and the camera API with photo orientation, right? So you'd take a photo, and it would come into your app, and it wouldn't be rotated the right way. So this is the hack I came up with, and it's not perfect, but it's kind of crazy, but it actually kind of worked, I think, maybe. So the first thing I did was modify that camera.java file, and I actually wrote so you can get the orientation from the EXIF headers in that Java file, and I just appended the orientation value to the final URI that gets passed into PhoneGap. And then in my JavaScript, I extract out this orientation value from there. And the orientation is this value, I think it goes from it's like 0, 3, 6, 8. It has a couple different values. And based on that, you can kind of figure out a degree to orient your picture. So what I do in the JavaScript is that I use an HTML5 canvas. So I make the canvas. I draw the image into the canvas, and then I rotate the canvas, and then I take the image back out of the canvas using data URI. So it's kind of crazy and long, but it kind of worked, and it was a nice introduction to Canvas. So yeah, so I definitely encountered multiple issues with using the camera API, and mostly, again, this is on Android across multiple devices, right? It worked brilliantly on my test device, and then not so well on other ones. And so that's the other thing, is that when you are using PhoneGap, you can't just test on your handy, whatever you have, like an N1 or Nexus S. You're going to have multiple Android phones on hand. With iPhone, it's great. You test on like 2 and you're done. All right, so finally we get to the mobile browsers, right? And mostly this is me hating on Android. So I wear this shirt that shows Android, but actually he looks all happy here. If I had time, I wanted to make an animation where it's me shooting the Android, and then he's dying in a pool of blood, on the bottom of the slide. But I didn't have time for that. So if anyone wants to animate that for me later, it'd be awesome. So mobile browsers. So there's a few common issues that we run into with mobile browsers. There's stuff they don't support as well as we'd like them to. There's ways they work differently on mobile than on desktop. So when we say mobile browsers, we mean the Android WebKit and the iPhone WebKit. And so luckily they're both WebKit, which is great, but the Android WebKit is the worst WebKit ever, right? I think they forked it years ago and then just laid it in a dungeon to die. So first we have the dealing with fixed positioning, right? Because you want fixed positions, CSS position fixed in your app so you can have a header and a footer, right? Unfortunately, on some older versions of iOS, fixed positioning doesn't work. So you have to do this fix for fixed positioning, where you basically position static and absolute, and you have to calculate it every time it possibly changed. So I end up having a fixed function and a setup fixed, and it is fixed broken, and all these lovely named functions in order to fix this issue. And to figure out whether it's actually broken, I couldn't do feature detection. Everyone says these days that you shouldn't do user agent sniffing, you should be doing feature detection. But as it turns out, there's a lot of stuff that you just can't do feature detection for, right? Either because the feature doesn't give itself any way to be detected, or because the feature works, but it doesn't work great, or something like that. So I found that many times when dealing with mobile browsers, in the end, I just had to do a user agent sniffing, right? Like, oh, is this Safari 5.0.13? All right, then we're not going to be able to use the file API or something. So yeah, so there's a little fixed fix. Then we have touch events, lovely touch events. So you can start off your PhoneGap app using click events, but then you'll soon realize that it just doesn't feel that responsive because it just takes longer for a mobile device to trigger a click event, right? So then you start moving to touch events. So I started off with touch events just using a touch library. Zepto had touch support out of the box, and I was like, oh, this is great. I'll just throw it in and everything will just work. Unfortunately, it didn't just work. I ended up basically having to write my own touch handlers and spend a lot of time debugging the touch handlers to understand where it worked and where it didn't work. And in the end, I have a function which is the add touch or click handler and also the click handler. And so sometimes there's some situations where I add a touch handler, and there's some ones where I add a click handler because some of them worked with touch and some of them didn't. And I never quite figured out why, so I had to have both. So it's really ugly to think about and to look at, but that was the reality of it. So here's my add touch or click handler. And then also when it comes to testing, I actually do Selenium testing on the mobile app in the browser. So there, you actually, if you're in the iPhone simulator, you actually have to manually trigger a tap event instead of doing a click, because that's the only way you're able to test it. So dealing with touch events is interesting. Fortunately, it wasn't as easy as I had hoped. And then we have scrolling, right? There's the whole issue of scrolling through long list views and performance and stuff like that. But for me, the big issue with scrolling was simply resetting scroll to the top of a page. And it's actually pretty simple to fix that. But it gets interesting when everything combines together. You can't read it all. But here was a bug I found that combined scrolling plus fixed positioning plus touch events, right? So here's me commenting on this thread where I said, my touch events were no longer triggered on buttons in a fixed position after I manually scrolled. So this is a crazy bug to find, right? Because it's like really, really specific. And once I found it, I had no idea what was going on. And I managed to actually find a crazy hack, and it was basically like a monkey typing on a keyboard in order to find the hack that would work, right? And this is what happens sometimes. And so if you look at this thread, this is on this issue tracker, which is the device bugs issue tracker, and Scott Gell started it. To just track general device bugs that mobile web app developers run into. So it's a good one to check out if you're just running into some iPhone or Android issue. And this is the issue number 1 on there with scrolling plus fixed plus touch events. And it's a long thread of people encountering different combinations of issues in this kind of area and their different fixes. And everybody has a slightly different hack. And it's kind of gross because you hope in programming that when you run into a bug, you can figure out what's actually causing it, and then you can fix it. But I found a lot of times with the mobile stuff that I would run into the bug, and I would never be able to actually figure out what really caused it, and I would just put a hack in there that would fix it, but I didn't understand why, right? And it sucks as a programmer to have to do something like that, because you want to really understand what's going on. But sometimes those the mobile browsers, I can't get inside their head and figure it out. So that's life. Okay, so another thing we deal with mobile browsers is keyboards, right? Because one of the interesting things about mobile browsers is that they have these keyboards that pop up, and they actually have lots of different keyboards, right? So there's some keyboards, your standard keyboard is like this alphanumeric one, yada, yada. There's other keyboards that are actually just for numbers, and there's some keyboards that are just for dollar amounts or just for phone calling. So I did a lot of experimentation to try and figure out how to get the right keyboards to show up. And I wrote a blog post with my experiments there. But basically, I had a field where I wanted people entering numbers and periods for their weight measurement. After about 10 different iterations, I finally figured out the right input type to actually use there with the right attribute to get what I wanted on the 2 different Android and iOS devices. So that's something you have to think about when you're doing this mobile app development is the keyboard interaction and when the keyboard is popping up and what type of keyboard it is and what symbols are available and what's going to be the most user-friendly for your user. You can always default to the alphanumeric keyboard, but it sure would be a lot nicer for your user if they're entering numbers if they get the number keyboard, right? But it's not straightforward right now, and you kind of have to do experimentation to figure out which one's going to be best for you. Sometimes you also need to force hide the keyboard, and there's this crazy hack to do that in Android. And now for what I spent the most amount of time on, which seems like the easiest thing ever, but getting focus in a text field. Just getting a blinking cursor in a text field was the thing that I spent the most time on in mobile web app development, which just sounds ridiculous because you think it can't be that hard to just get a cursor in a text field. But I ended up spending a full week on this, right? So on Android, for whatever reason, when I focused on a text field, you say text field.focus, and you should get your blinking cursor there. It just wouldn't work. And I didn't understand why, and it seemed to be some combination of using touch events and fixed positioning and all this stuff. I had a lot of ranty tweets where I was trying to figure this out. I was so confused, and I was stumped, and finally I gave up. So in the end, I never figured it out. I just said, fine, I'm not going to get the cursor in the keyboard. So that's another thing that sucks is that at some point, you just may not be able to figure it out. This is the thing about doing mobile web app development is that everything's moving really fast right now. And the browser bugs that you're running into you might be actually the first ones to run into those browser bugs, right? So you may not actually find documented fixes for them. Whereas if you're doing my boyfriend does cross-browser development, including IE7, right? So very often, he'll be doing IE7 fixes, and I'll be doing Android fixes, and then we'll basically have an argument over whose life is worse. Because that's the thing. So what I'd say is with IE stuff, those bugs have been out for a long time. So when you run into something in an IE, it's pretty much known, and you can find the answer. It's annoying, but you can find the answer. When you run into something on a mobile browser, you're not necessarily going to find any, it's possible you're the first one who ran into it, and there's so few people that are actually doing this mobile web app development that there's just not that big of a pool of resources. So unfortunately, you're not always going to find those answers. So that's why it's actually really important for you guys that if you run into anything, you should document it, especially if you find a fix for it, right? Because if you spent 2 days trying to figure something out, and you found a solution to it, you should put it out there and let people know, because we have to build up this knowledge base. And yeah, the browsers keep changing, and so possibly the thing you ran into is going to be obsolete in a month or something, but you never know. So write a blog post, put it in that device bugs issue tracker, just put it out there somewhere, because we got to build up the resources here so we can actually learn from each other. So yeah, some things you have to give up on and give up on focus. Another thing I had to deal with is offline detection. So it's actually a requirement in the App Store guidelines that your app must show when it's offline, and to show the user that they're currently offline and you can't do stuff. So since my app got rejected the first time I put it in the App Store for looking too much like a web page, conveniently it is a web page, but then the second time around I made sure I'd adhered to every single guideline they had. So for offline detection, basically I have a function that I run and I pass in a message, and if I detect that I'm offline, I show that message instead. So for offline detection, PhoneGap gives this navigator.network. So I was originally using navigator.network to see if there was a connection type of none, and that's how I put out the app first. But then I had one user that ran into a situation where they definitely had a connection, but that was returning none. So as you see at the end there, I have an n and 0. So I do not use that if anymore because I just don't have confidence in it. I don't know why the user was getting a connection of none when they were online, but I certainly don't want to prevent a user from doing something, right? So you have to be careful with the offline detection that either you always make it possible to do something even if you think they're offline, or you only tell them they're offline when you're really sure of it. So I just use the navigator.online property, and that seems to work fairly well. All right, so finally we have performance, right? We talk a lot about performance for websites, but performance for mobile apps matters a lot too. And there's two types of performance, right? There's a loading performance, which is, you're starting up your app, and you see that loading screen, and you're waiting for the splash screen to appear, right? And that was the first thing I wanted to tackle, because I realized it was taking 5 seconds for my app to load. And that was really annoying, because I'm at a meal, and I want to take a picture of my phone, and I'm sitting there awkwardly, just waiting. I'm like, come on, PhoneGap, come on, do it. So I really wanted to take care of that loading performance. So what I did was I measured, I actually timed all the different events and all the different things that happened in my app and put them in a spreadsheet. And it was taking me 5,700 milliseconds until I finally got to the camera being able to use, right, which was way too long. And I did all this using this timing code, which is pretty simple. You can get it from my site. So the first thing I noticed was that the jQuery tag was taking a long time to parse, 800 milliseconds, even though it was actually cached locally. So this wasn't a size thing. This was just a parsing JavaScript thing. So the first thing I did was port from jQuery to Zepto, which is a more lightweight framework. And that ended up shaving about 22% off the time. So that was pretty sweet. And I wrote up a post about how I did that. So that got me down more. But I was still at 5,000 milliseconds, which is quite a bit, right? So the next thing I did was that I just investigated everything that happened before those 5,000 milliseconds, and I posted in the PhoneGap group, and we managed to figure out that basically when I was doing an XML HP request in the onload, it was slowing the amount of time it took for Android to get to the device ready event. And that's when we realized that you have to try and not do much of anything in onload and try and just do everything in device ready. So I spent a while taking as much things as I could out of the onload event handler and moving them into the PhoneGap device ready handler, and got a huge improvement of 67% for that. So that shaved 67% of my loading time, and that was like massive, right? So now I just have, when I'm in onload, I'm just setting up page CSS and binding DOM events. And in the device ready, that's when I show the slash page, that's when I go out and fetch data, and that's when I bind PhoneGap events. So defer as much as you can until that device ready event. And keep in mind when you're architecting your app that that's ideally what you want to do. All right, so once you have it loaded, then you have to worry about rendering performance. So I kept running into this issue on Android where my app would literally look like this. It would white out the app. So the majority of the app was just white on Android. And I was like, what is this? My app is not supposed to be white. There's supposed to be stuff here. And I realized that Android, at least the Android on my phone, had a lot of performance issues with rendering fancy things. And when I say fancy things, I mean border radius, because apparently rounded corners is very hard for Android. So yeah, I found that Android just wasn't doing so good with that. So the first thing I did was I basically stripped out all of the fancy things from my Android CSS, and I kept it in my iPhone CSS. So for Android, when I would put an Android class on the body of the page, and for everything that had fancy stuff, and this is using Bootstrap, so I was overriding Bootstrap stuff, I would set the box shadow to none, I would set the border radius to 0 pixels, and doing that caused a huge improvement in the actual rendering performance of Android. Like, I didn't get the whiteouts anymore. And conveniently, it actually ended up matching the Android UI design guidelines much better, because Android came up with the design guidelines finally, and the design guidelines are basically the opposite of Apple. So Apple is all like rounded and gradient and cute, and Android is like this like square and all this stuff. So conveniently, it works out that in order to adhere to their guidelines, you don't have to use the fancy CSS. So that was good. And I also but I still had a problem with my stream. My stream is this very long sequence of updates from people, and when you scrolled it, eventually it would white out. So what I did there was implemented delayed image loading. So basically, I would only load images that were visible in the viewport. So that ends up being a lot better, and that's something you should do for websites as well if you have long series of images. So yeah. And another thing I did was I basically set timeout like all over the place. Like most of my stuff is surrounded by a set timeout in my code, because I found that if the way JavaScript works is that it does everything, and then the JavaScript executes, and then it updates the UI loop, and then et cetera, et cetera. So if you have a code that, if you have JavaScript that is trying to do a lot of stuff, it prevents the UI from updating while it's doing that stuff. So for a lot of things, a lot of my heavy JavaScript, like fetching data and setting up big DOM things, I would actually do a window.setTimeout so that if there was any UI updating that had to happen, it could happen, and then the JavaScript would do that heavy stuff, right? So this ends up just making your app feel a little more responsive while it's running. All right, so those are most of the pain points I encountered, and the kind of things that made mobile web app development painful. And much of it isn't actually about PhoneGap. Much of it is just about mobile browsers. But the cool thing is that really, like, that's, I started a year ago, and it was all very early then. But the future's bright. So PhoneGap is improving. As we saw today, we're at PhoneGap 2, 3, one of those numbers, which is awesome. And then also the community is growing, and the resources are growing, and hopefully more of you guys, will start documenting everything you run into, and we'll have more and more blog posts about how to better do stuff. But most importantly, you can't even see that. The Android browser looks like it might be getting replaced by the Chrome browser. So the Android WebKit by the Chrome browser, and hopefully we'll be able to actually use that as the embedded browser in the future, because the Chrome WebKit and the Chrome JavaScript engine are much, much better than what we have on Android right now. And for me, at least, a lot of what I dealt with was those Android browser issues. So that's the most exciting thing for me. So even though there were some not so pleasant parts of working with PhoneGap. Still really happy that I picked it, and I think that as long as it's just appropriate to set your expectations right. So if you know that there's going to be some parts that aren't so fun, and you're ready for it, then you'll be able to handle them well, and now it's just going to be even better going forward. So thanks for letting me rant.